Okay, let's get going. So welcome everybody to our Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety webinar titled Safety versus Safety, Understanding and Overcoming Conflicts Between Street Safety and Fire and Emergency Response, presented by Dr. Zachary Lamb from UC Berkeley. My name is Nick Franchak. I'm the director of the Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety and a professor in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of New Mexico. Our center is a 5-year university transportation center supported by the US DOT. We consist of the University of New Mexico, also San Diego State, University of California, Berkeley, University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. We've got a ton of great research going on all across the center, so please feel free to check out our website, pedbikesafety.org, and you can read all the reports there. In addition to all the research, we've got our webinar series. We're shooting for at least one free monthly webinar each month. We've also got a newsletter. If you go to our website, you go to the bottom, you can put in your email address there and sign up. And we've also got a LinkedIn that you can follow us on. So whenever we come up with a new paper, report, presentation, anything like that, we're usually posting it there. So to get into the today's webinar, if you do have any questions throughout the presentation, you should have a Q&A box on the ribbon at the bottom of your screen. So if you go and put your questions in the Q&A box, our program manager, Ben Garland, will be monitoring that, and then we'll be moderating the Q&A session at the end. Hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So today our presenter is Dr. Zachary Lamb. Zach Lamb is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of California, Berkeley. His work focuses on the role of urban planning and design in shaping uneven vulnerability and resilience in the face of climate change. His first book, The Equitably Resilient City, Solidarities and Struggles in the Face of Climate Crises, co-authored with Dr. Lawrence J. Vail of MIT, was published by MIT Press in 2024 and won the Urban Affairs Association's Award for the Best Book of 2025. Dr. Lamb received his PhD from MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning in 2018 and was Princeton Mellon Fellow in Urbanism and the Environment. Zach also received his Master's of Architecture from MIT, after which he worked on post-Katrina reconstruction for several years in New Orleans. So Zach, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Nick, and thank you, Ben, and thanks for the invitation to be with this group today. It's really exciting to present this work. We're coming towards the end of our first phase of the project, and it's always exciting to hear feedback from folks. So I'm hoping we'll have plenty of time towards the end to be in conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and hopefully everything will work cleanly. Let's see. There we go. And
looks good.
Great. All right. There we go. So yeah, as Nick said, a lot of my research is actually on climate change vulnerability in cities more broadly. But I also am a bike commuter, and for the last 5 years, I've commuted with at least one small child on my bike to school. And so this question of how cities deal with emergencies and how cities deal with disasters, and how those kinds of priorities might come into conflict with or interact with the kind of everyday street safety concerns that many of us face if we walk or bike to work or just in our normal lives. So that was a sort of genesis of this project. And so again, I'm really excited to share this work with everyone here today. So the research questions motivating the project were: when and why do fire and EMS response and street safety goals come into conflict? And then subsequently, what practices are emerging to reconcile these conflicts or to find synergies between these goals? And then finally, how might we spread best practices from places that have confronted these problems and largely overcome them? And so this is part of a 1-year exploratory research project identifying patterns of conflicts and solutions. And we're not really as focused on specific code or design changes, although I'll mention a bunch of those kinds of questions here today. So the project team included myself as a PI and Laura Lutzker, sorry, Eliza Lutzker from Safe Trek and Julia Griswold from Safe Trek, along with a team of really amazing undergraduate research assistants that helped to power the whole project over the last year. There were sort of four main components to the project. We did a literature review. We developed what we call a conflicts and solutions database. So we gathering examples of these kinds of conflicts and solutions from around the country into a database. And then we dug into four deeper case studies in cities across the country that have confronted and overcome these kinds of challenges. And all of this was informed by a group that we called our Community Advisory Committee, that included a range of folks who come to these questions from a bunch of different professional perspectives. So as I proceed through the talk today, I'll kind of briefly touch on each of these elements, and spend the bulk of the time really on the conflicts and solutions database and the case studies, before we break for Q&A and questions. So our CAC, our Community Advisory Committee, as I said, included folks who are from a bunch of different perspectives. We had fire chiefs and fire marshals. We had EMS folks. We had transportation designers and engineers. We had advocates. We had public safety directors. So really trying to gather a group that could help us think through these problems and make sure that the way we were asking the questions and the way we were proceeding in the research stayed grounded in the kinds of concerns that practitioners across these different perspectives are facing on a day-to-day basis. The lit review, we looked at scholarly literature, so journals and journal articles and books. We also looked at gray literature, so reports from government agencies and advocacy organizations. And we also dug into lots of popular media, so blogs and news reports and social media even, to kind of gather a range of what has been said and what is known about these conflicts and the ways that they're being overcome. And again, the topic here is the relationship between fire and EMS response and sort of safe street designs. And broadly speaking, the lit review we found that there's in terms of documentation of conflicts and solutions, a lot of this is coming just from local news sources and blogs, where we do have empirical studies of mostly that's focused on the impacts of traffic calming and street safety interventions on emergency response, often really kind of pretty narrowly focused on response times. And those kinds of studies are mostly being published in scholarly articles and in technical reports. And then we looked at a range of manuals, guides, and best practices for design to reduce conflicts, and that's mostly from the kind of gray literature, so emerging either from local practitioners or from advocacy organizations or others in those realms. And then finally, we had sort of discussions of deeper institutional and cultural drivers of conflict that were largely treated primarily in books, and those were kind of rarely informed by empirical study, I would say. So then just jumping into the conflicts and solutions database, we were focused on US conflicts and solutions. We were focused on urban areas, so cities and towns. We were mostly looking at issues that had emerged since 2010. And we were drawing from data sources from local media, social media, and also from our Community Advisory Committee input. So we met 3 times over the course of the project with the Community Advisory Committee members to kind of keep them posted and to hear from their feedback. And some of what came from those sessions was, well, you guys really ought to look at what's happening over here at this place. You ought to see how they're managing this problem over here. So there was really essential feedback and guidance. We ended up with over 30 documented conflicts and over 70 documented solutions in more than 40 cities. And just to kind of briefly sketch a picture of what we found in the conflicts and solutions database. We found a kind of a range of kind of precipitating events that brought on these kind of conflicts. So we saw, single proposals, like a particular bike lane that was proposed or built that might lead to some pushback or conflict. We also saw larger initiatives like ballot initiatives or broader plans that also sometimes invited conflict or opposition from various sectors. And then in many cases, there actually were no public conflicts at all, but sort of just simmering under the surface interdepartmental kinds of discussions and tensions. In terms of who the originating actors were in these conflicts, in some cases we had fire departments and EMS services who had operational concerns or conflicts between existing standards and procedures that they were trying to meet. In other cases, we had elected officials that raised these issues. In some cases they were real, and in some cases they seemed to be proxies for other issues. So kind of cultural conflicts or constituent backlash or concerns about traffic congestion or parking, for instance. And then in other cases, we had sort of other kind of broader publics, neighbors, and kind of citizens groups that might be the initiators of these conflicts. And in some cases, again, these were kind of real concerns about emergency response. And in other cases, it seemed that those emergency response concerns were kind of being invoked as part of a broader suite of concerns that might be about parking loss or neighborhood change or aesthetic concerns about bike or pedestrian infrastructure changes. And as I said, many of these conflicts never actually became public. A lot of them remained between staff and officials. Those that did become public, they came out in official proceedings, city council meetings, commission meetings. They were covered in local media. And then occasionally we even had a couple of cases that made it into the legal processes. And so just to kind of quickly walk through what some of these kinds of conflicts that we saw emerging were, we broadly saw three types of conflicts. And there's lots of overlap and interaction here, but for the sake of helping us understand what was going on, we started sort of sorting things into physical conflicts, institutional conflicts, and kind of cultural conflicts. And so on the physical side, we had these kind of access concerns. So road width, were roads wide enough to accommodate fire apparatuses, including their outriggers, for instance? Was there room and proper angled access for aerial and ladder access, hydrant access, turning radii, and maneuvering space for trucks? That was one set of kind of concerns. Another was concerns about response time, right? So do traffic calming devices and installations delay emergency response times? And then also the concern about losing pullover space that would inhibit emergency responders from moving through traffic, for instance. And then another set of concerns about evacuation capacity. So would a change to a street configuration impinge on evacuation functions of streets? On the institutional side, we saw conflicting standards and regulations. So, for instance, complete streets guidelines that conflicted with evacuation route design guidelines. We saw conflicting performance metrics, right? So lots of fire departments are evaluated on the basis of response time exclusively without taking into account broader kind of safety metrics, and that was a common kind of concern. And then process complaints included things that the consultation with fire departments and the EMS came too late, or it was not substantial enough, or and then in other cases we also saw other actors in these debates raising concerns that there were sort of inflexible uses of the fire department's veto power and fire departments not being willing to kind of look for mutually supportive solutions. On the cultural side, right? So we saw, on all sides, there were different kinds of cultural disconnects and tensions that emerged. So we saw from fire and EMS folks kind of concerns about like bike and pedestrian advocates not appreciating the operational pressures that emergency responders are operating under, and also just that road safety and preventing accidents is sort of not their job. And then on the bike and pedestrian advocate side, we saw what is often referred to as windshield bias, which is the idea that fire and emergency responders they're not thinking about the perspective of bicyclists and pedestrians, and so they're not really operating with their safety in mind. We also saw this sort of complaints about conservative firefighting culture, right? That might be sort of lead to a disproportionate focus on fire-specific equipment, even as the kind of proportion of calls in most jurisdictions is no longer really weighted towards structure fires so much, and it's much more on medical calls. And also the sort of invocation of the idea that there's a kind of affinity for big trucks, the big shiny truck problem, right? And then other actors, right? So we saw emergency response became a proxy for kind of deeper culture war and ideological battles. And this came up in a number of different settings, right? So these might be kind of YIMBY versus NIMBY battles or generational divides between younger and older residents or concerns about neighborhood change and gentrification that sometimes get sort of channeled into these conversations about emergency access and fire response. And so, as I said, we use these three buckets, physical, cultural, and institutional, to help us kind of map out what we were seeing. But obviously, there's lots of interaction between them, right? And I'm not going to run through all this complex diagram now, but just to recognize that these things are all kind of deeply intertwined. So, but on the much more sort of fun side of the equation, the solutions side, right? So we started documenting what were cities doing to kind of overcome these concerns, and we saw a whole range of street design standards that were informed by fire and EMS concerns. So mountable curbs, relocating street trees and utilities to make sidewalk space available as kind of part of the clear width for fire apparatus access. We saw lots of jurisdictions using various forms of pilot testing and mock-ups to actually go out and, rather than relying on a sort of imported code standard to say like, well, let's actually see if we do a curb radius, a bump out like this, or if we use a curb separated bike lane in this space, what's that going to do for the ability of our drivers and emergency responders to get where they need to get and perform the work they need to perform. We saw some jurisdictions that were adopting kind of pre-approved designs, so sort of developing a menu of pre-approved designs that could then be implemented without having to go through project by project review to make sure that they weren't impinging on fire and emergency response. And then we also saw some cities and jurisdictions experimenting with equipment change, right? So buying smaller trucks, more maneuverable trucks, and also deploying smaller vehicles when a fire engine or pump or ladder truck isn't necessary, right? So that could be anything from motorcycles to ATVs to kind of SUV style vehicles for the kind of bulk of calls where there isn't actually a need for firefighting equipment. On the institutional side, we saw kind of shifts in standards and definitions, right? So defining clear width to actually of access space to include sidewalks and other surfaces that the trucks could mount. We saw changes in code adoption and code reform, so sort of selective adoption of national codes to reflect local conditions and allow for more flexibility. We saw design review processes changing. So having earlier and more robust fire and EMS participation in design review processes, and also the institution of new kind of crossover and collaborative institutions. So like the San Francisco Street Design Advisory Team, for instance, where you sort of are bringing the relevant folks from across agencies together on a regular basis so that they can kind of build relationships and get to know one another better and operate more collaboratively. And we saw operating procedures innovating, right? So new dispatch and call screening practices to right size crews and vehicles for different types of calls, so that you aren't sending out the massive truck to every single call. And then we saw equipment procurement changes, for instance, transportation officials serving on fire equipment procurement teams so that they can kind of help guide those decisions in ways that will work with the city's streets. On the culture side, right, this stuff gets a little bit stickier, right? Like, how do you change departmental cultures to encourage more collaboration and more solutions orientation? And we saw a few different interesting examples here, and I'll go into some of this more deeply in the case studies. But we saw sort of shifting efforts to shift or expand fire department missions, right? So here in Berkeley, there's this effort called the Street Trauma Prevention Program that is newly launched that's meant to kind of bring the fire department into the prevention of street trauma in the first place. Also in Portland, Oregon, there's been this effort to kind of view street vitality as a sort of safety enhancement. And so to kind of widen the set of concerns that firefighters and EMS officials are kind of see as being under their purview. And then we have kind of relationship and trust building. So how do you, efforts to build more robust communication between department heads and then also between department heads and unions and rank and file staff. And then in some cases, we heard from various officials that actually just physical proximity and regular meetings were really essential to just overcoming divisions and a sense of kind of oppositional approaches. Um, and then looking at how do we change incentives, right? So recognizing how do you recognize and evaluate fire and EMS services beyond response time, looking at more holistic metrics, and then also looking to how do you make sure that the fire departments and EMS officials are getting credit and getting the positive media attention and public attention that they deserve when they are productively contributing to street safety efforts. And then, even more exciting was really these places where we can think beyond conflict resolution to actually find synergies, to find the places that these goals of improving street safety and improving emergency response actually support one another. And so we've heard multiple examples of things like designing protected bicycle lanes to be able to accommodate emergency access, right? To allow emergency vehicles to move through traffic on a protected bike lane, for instance. We heard from a number of people that really connected street grids were an essential way to allow more flexibility for fire and EMS access. And we in the urban design world have long advocated for connected street grids as part of improving walkability in cities. And then corner daylighting and visibility improvements also, while they improve bike and pedestrian safety, they also make it easier to maneuver giant trucks in tight areas. And then broadly, these kind of like bigger culture shift kinds of things, like seeking shared interests. Like, how do we start to see street vitality as part of safety? How do we start to bring fire departments and EMS officials into a kind of prevention posture with respect to street safety? And we also heard from officials in a number of places about the kind of mental health toll and the trauma toll that responding to street trauma imposes on emergency responders. And so recognizing that reducing these street trauma events has a real benefit for first responders as well in terms of reducing those traumatic exposures for them. So again, sort of thinking about the ways that solutions also, much like conflicts, don't fit nicely into these sort of physical, cultural, and institutional buckets, but really overlap and bleed into one another. And so after we did we built this conflicts and solutions database. We decided we really need to drill down deeper into 4 different case study cities to understand the kind of deeper and often sort of not public story behind these conflicts and solutions. And so we selected these 4 cities of Austin, Texas, Baltimore, Maryland, Berkeley, California, and Nashville, Tennessee, to represent a kind of range of types of cities in terms of size and age and mode share and region. And also a range of different kinds of conflicts that had emerged and different types of solutions that had been kind of created to deal with those conflicts. And so to better understand each of these 4 cases, we conducted a bunch of semi-structured interviews with folks across different perspectives in each of these cities, from fire and EMS officials to planning officials and transportation folks, advocates, both pro bike lane and pedestrian safety infrastructure advocates, and folks who had come out against these efforts, and then also a couple of elected officials as well. We conducted these interviews, we recorded them, we transcribed them, we coded them thematically and then as part of the analysis. And then we combined what we learned from that analysis with a review of kind of relevant documents in each of the 4 cities. And we're kind of just coming to the end of this work, so we're still kind of gelling the takeaways, but I'll share where we are with each of these at the moment, and excited for the conversation to help inform it more. So starting in Austin, Austin's a large old city and it's a state capital. It's grown really rapidly in the last several decades. It's a diverse economy. There's a range of kind of both new development and densification happening in the city, and it's a city manager-led city. the city has largely has wide streets, but also high congestion. But there's a growing support for multimodal transportation in the city, including a couple of recent bond initiatives that have garnered widespread popular support and approval from voters that are funding lots of new upgrades and improvements for bikes and pedestrians, bicyclists and pedestrians. And the fire department in Austin handles both fire and severe medical incidents, but there is a separate EMS provider in Austin, which was an interesting sort of wrinkle on what we saw in some of the other cities, and it was super useful to see the differences in perspective from the fire side and the EMS side in our interviews there. And also Austin, like Nashville, has a really significant experience with sort of special events, festivals, those kinds of things, and that kind of flexibility that is required from those kinds of events seems to contribute to their ability to overcome these conflicts. So there was no sort of major public blow up in Austin. There were a couple of projects that sort of initiated a discussion about the relationship between street safety interventions and fire and emergency response, including a large traditional neighborhood development um, uh, project called the Mueller Development, where they were trying to build narrower streets than were typically allowed in fire codes. And then there was also a sort of debate that got initiated in 2017 when the city was debating adopting the International Fire Code, and there were transportation officials in the city were concerned about the kind of absolute veto power of fire officials that was enshrined in that code adoption, and that sort of kicked off a broader collaboration between several city departments to try to head off these conflicts and create a more collaborative approach. The immediate conflicts were really largely around kind of clear width requirements for fire apparatus, and again, this veto power for the fire chief that's enshrined in the IFC. The Institutionally speaking, there was really a lack of kind of formalized design standards or widely adhered to review practices. And then there was also a kind of elevation of one type of safety over others in the sense that there was a kind of an approach that sort of saw fires as worse than other ways to be harmed. And in terms of finding solutions here in Austin, it was they've done a remarkable job of building a kind of collaboration between transportation officials and fire officials in particular, and EMS as well. And that's largely kind of comes down to building a kind of culture of learning and cooperation, including a 2019 Netherlands study tour where transportation and fire officials went together to the Netherlands to observe how bike infrastructure interfaces with fire and emergency response there. And there's this sort of attitude that there's no problem that can't be resolved over lunch, right? So that just culture of communication and collaboration between these departments, and partly that came out of this enforced the council sort of encouraged the transportation department and the fire department to sit down together to develop some collaborative procedures. And so in 2018, there was a working group and a memorandum issued that included this alternative methods of compliance for narrow streets, right? That sort of just set aside an alternative pathway for how to approve narrower streets where necessary. There was also this development of the 2019 Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, which included lots of fire department input and contributions. And then in 2022, the city adopted their transportation criteria manual, which includes pre-approved designs for bike and pedestrian safety improvements that were developed alongside fire officials. So they have this sort of preset menu of acceptable options that they can work with. And so some of the kind of keys to success here in Austin were a flexible approach to code application, including that alternative methods of compliance memo that I spoke about, kind of pre-approved design standards, flexible dispatching, including EMS, so making sure you're sending the right size vehicle to the right kinds of calls. Lots of experience with road closures and events, which made folks a bit more flexible and willing to kind of consider alternative ways of operating. And then, underlying all of this is this kind of collaborative can-do mindset that really pervaded all of our conversations with folks in Austin. Um, And then there, obviously some remaining challenges. The city continues to grow really rapidly, which brings with it all kinds of challenges in terms of just, the access and capacity on streets. And then also a lot of the design standards they've developed are more focused on new development. And so, retrofitting existing urban street grids is obviously much more complicated because you're dealing with inherited spatial conditions there. So jumping over to Baltimore here, very different kind of geography, very different kind of city, but also a large city in a major metropolitan area. Diverse, majority Black city, but highly sort of segregated. There's both kind of been population loss for the greater part of 70 years, but also a considerable amounts of gentrification in specific neighborhoods. And Baltimore is a mayor-led city. Um, it's an old city with narrower streets and a more sort of defined grid than much of Austin. Uh, Over a quarter of households don't have a private vehicle, and so transit use is high. The bike mode share is relatively low, but there's a strong bike advocacy community and a kind of growing network of bike infrastructure across the city. And the fire department in Baltimore is a historic department with sort of longstanding traditions, a really strong union, and but lots of firefighters live outside of Baltimore in surrounding communities. So here in Baltimore, the situation was a little different. There was really a precipitating event that really sparked this conflict, and it was a two-way cycle track that was proposed on Potomac Street in the Canton neighborhood, and the Department of Transportation, the fire department, the fire unions, and a couple of different opposing advocacy groups really lined up in a protracted conflict around this particular proposal. So there were neighbors who were primarily concerned initially about aesthetic concerns and parking access, but later kind of brought in the fire department as part of their opposition. The mayor got behind the proposal to remove the bike lane in part out of a kind of allegiance to the fire unions, which had been supporters. And then the bike advocacy community, Bike More in particular, led a lawsuit to fight back against this removal of this specific bike lane. The city settled, and they were able to kind of redesign the project to work. And then after that settlement, the mayor actually continued to sort of threaten to remove all of the bike lanes across the city. It largely out of stated concerns about fire and emergency access. And so the underlying conflicts here were that there was just really pretty bad communication between the Department of Transportation and fire departments. There was the processes for plan review were largely informal, often ignored. Fire department felt like they would give input on things and they wouldn't see that input reflected. There was high turnover, staff turnover, leadership turnover, and elected official turnover that really impacted the kind of continuity and the ability to move the project forward. And then there were also these sort of just deeper cultural divides, political divisions and allegiances, and also it became a kind of toxic atmosphere around this project and the subsequent debates. So people sort of lined up on either side, and it became very difficult to make progress towards more collaborative approaches. Ultimately, there was the city council approved an amendment that repealed portions of the International Fire Code in for Baltimore because they had a hard time getting the fire department to propose alternative methods of reconciling these challenges. So they removed the 26-foot clear width requirement and instead required using NACTO guidelines that were called for much narrower travel lanes. They also formalized their plan review processes, really set down some procedures for who gets consulted when, how the feedback gets incorporated. And they also the city council called for the DOT and the fire department to collaboratively build out a complete streets manual for the city that included the concerns of the fire department. Um, to the extent that we can point to success in Baltimore, it's there's this strong, sustained advocacy community, the political leadership from the city council that was supportive of these bike safety improvements was really able to kind of keep the pressure on and allow things to move forward. There was this sort of legislative approach, right? The kind of changes in code adoption that institutionalized the change. And we can think of that as a positive in some ways, but we also heard from some folks on the ground in Baltimore that code change approach actually kind of reinforced a bit of an antagonistic atmosphere, right? So it didn't actually solve the deeper underlying institutional and cultural conflicts that had driven this conflict in the first place. And so the fire department officials continue to be skeptical about bike infrastructure, effectiveness, and mode shift. And there is kind of continued limited collaboration, and the staffing within the DOT actually has been a significant issue in terms of rolling out more collaborative solutions there. Here in Berkeley, where I sit today, it was our third case study. We are a kind of medium-sized college town and commuter town in a large metro area, quite high density and increasing density. Our population is, aside from the student population, is aging and gentrifying. And we're a city manager-led city. We have a pretty high bike mode share, around 10%, and high pedestrian mode share, around 15%, and a long tradition of kind of street safety activism here, including these kind of Berkeley barriers and diverters that you see around town if you ever come out this way. We have an aging population that tends to be more concentrated in kind of more car-oriented parts of the city. And our fire department does dual fire and EMS responsibilities. They have a really high call volume per capita. They're quite busy and they're increasingly focused on the kind of mounting wildfire threat here, which brings with it evacuation concerns as well. And the kind of motivating event here in Berkeley was again a kind of protected cycle track proposal for Hopkins Street, which came out of a call from a city council person to do a major kind of placemaking streetscape improvement on this corridor, and it's a kind of much beloved commercial corridor through a kind of higher end part of the city. And so the city council was part of this story. The Department of Public Works Transportation Division was the kind of project managers. Berkeley Fire Department became more engaged later in the process. And then there were, again, kind of advocacy groups lined up on either side. We had our local bike and pedestrian advocacy organization, Walk Bike Berkeley, and then an organization called Save Hopkins that formed among neighbors and others in the area that were opposed to these proposals. And so the immediate conflicts here were about clear width for fire apparatus and about concerns about emergency evacuation constraints on the street once the cycle track were to be implemented. Underlying issues that came up were that there were some folks who regarded the consultation with the fire department as being too late or inadequate. This was disputed among different actors. We talked to different people and they would tell us very different things about what this consultation looked like. And there was also considerable staff and leadership turnover, which was a theme that we saw in a couple of places where, if you have these long-term projects that can really take a long time from, initiation to design to implementation of streetscape improvements. If you have turnover among leadership or staff at the relevant agencies, it can be really hard to make sure that you're coordinating and keeping things moving in a collaborative direction. There were these sort of deeper cultural conflicts that kind of came into play on this thing, where we heard people talking about intergenerational culture wars and ideological battles and the kind of war on cars, people sort of perceiving that this was a kind of battle to change the way longtime residents had lived in their city and really resented that. And then there were also kind of just more prosaic concerns about merchants' parking concerns on the commercial corridor here. And so those concerns then, there was a lot of that kind of discussion and debate around, the place of cars and parking, but it was really only kind of later in the process when the fire department was in these evacuation concerns were evoked. And that's really what eventually shut down the project. In the wake of this kind of failed project and the kind of institutional trauma that many folks around here on various sides of this conflict feel around it, there have been some positive changes that have come out of it. So there's been, again, a kind of formalization of review processes and consultation. So clear procedures for who gets consulted when, how those comments get addressed or yeah, how they get addressed. And then another kind of interesting and emerging piece of the story here is the beginning of this thing that's called the Street Trauma Prevention Program, which is a staffed position within the fire department that's focused on prevention of street trauma. And this was really inspired by the fire service's sort of turn towards a prevention posture with respect to structure fires that was came out in the 1970s, and the idea that there could be a sort of similar shift on the street trauma side that could bring the fire service into the fight to improve street safety. The keys to progress here: consensus-minded leadership among fire department and advocates, focus on fire department strengths, right? So like focusing on the prevention side of things and again, kind of bringing the fire department, inviting them to be a part of that process. And then kind of this long sustained advocacy from outside groups, from city commissions, from city council members. And this is not by any means a sort of solved problem here in Berkeley. There's this persistent intergenerational culture war talk continues to come up again and again. This transportation division morale is quite low after this conflict, and also the kind of there are in the interviews with folks on various sides of this street trauma prevention program, there's a lot of kind of conflicting expectations and lack of clarity about what that program will actually look like and what it will do. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are curious to learn more. Last case study I'll talk about is in Nashville, and this is kind of the earliest. It's sort of in the earliest phases of. Sorry, I'm gonna make this notification disappear off my screen. 1 second. So Nashville's kind of in the earliest stages of the four cities that we looked at in terms of both their journey into improving bicyclist and pedestrian street safety, and also kind of confronting these challenges and potential tensions with fire and EMS. So again, Nashville's a large city, state capital. Sort of like Austin, there's been some sort of changing politics and changing expectations from new arrivals in the city who expect, more diverse transportation options. There's a kind of mix of retrofits and densification and kind of new districts being built. It's mayor-led city. There's been a lot of kind of growth-driven traffic congestion in the city, but there's also been a kind of sustained political support for multimodal transport, including the mayor's 2024 ballot initiative called Choose How You Move that got widespread popular support and is going to raise lots of money to do both improve transit access, but also sidewalks and pedestrian and bicycle safety as well. They've formed a new DOT, kind of pulling transportation planning out of the Department of Public Works and putting it in a standalone Department of Transportation, and they've really been behind a lot of significant planning for interventions that's currently underway and rolling out now. There's a kind of collaborative orientation to the fire department. Folks say, you can't just close the door and say, hey, this isn't going to work. We have to figure out how to work with these changing conditions in the city. And also, again, like Austin, lots of experience with special events here in Nashville, from sporting events to major festivals and award shows and concerts and all that kind of stuff, which also seems to engender a certain degree of flexibility around fire and EMS response. In Nashville, there hasn't really, again, been a major public conflict. There have been lots of little retrofits and new road projects. And the primary actors here are the Nashville DOT, the fire department, planning department, and some advocacy groups that have gotten involved in these questions, along with some city commissions. There have been some kind of internal conflicts that have emerged, where you have sort of these major expansion of traffic calming and bike and pedestrian infrastructure. For when they really started rolling these efforts out, there was little to no consultation with the fire department. So the fire department would just sort of see a change in the street and then say, "Hey, this isn't going to work for us." And so it became a kind of case by case, ad hoc kind of process for resolving those issues. Often those issues were around fire access, fire lanes near buildings. So how's a truck going to access a building where it needs to, and ch street changes, making that more complicated or difficult. There was no formalized review and comment process to speak of until very recently, and and among other kind of policy issues that were complicating here, where the National Fire Department held personnel liable or responsible for equipment damage. So, like if a fire truck driver ran over a flex post and dinged a truck, they would be held liable for that and would have to cover the cost of repairs, which has obvious implications. And there's a kind of ongoing strong car and truck culture in Nashville. Um, the solutions that have emerged, and these are again kind of emergent solutions. At Nashville's at the early stages of confronting these challenges. So they are formalizing their review process. The fire marshal has developed he called his access group within the department to aid in coordination and review of both building and street changes. There are they're starting to develop a sort of menu of pre-approved designs, some of which have been kind of there have been some changes to standard specs for things like mountable curbs that have come out of these initial little wrinkles and hiccups in early projects. And then one of the things that Nashville Fire has been emphasizing is that they've, along with planning and DOT, have been developing a GIS layer of all the fire access areas to help kind of coordinate so that transportation knows when they need to retain access, for instance. Keys to progress here, growth and demographic change, political leadership has been sustained. And so, everyone knows that they need they don't want to get in the way of kind of the mayor's major priorities, which include improving multimodal transportation access, right? There's kind of consensus-minded leadership and staff. We heard from some folks about the importance of kind of doing some of this interagency work out of the spotlight, right? So that people don't get too entrenched, and you can find ways of supporting the needs of the various departments that may go beyond a single project, right? The new DOT seems to have been pretty successful in building relationships and building collaborations, and again, this sort of experience with large crowd events seems to be helpful. These are really early days for Nashville in terms of confronting these challenges. So there's a lot of this is still developing. There's some large new districts being developed where some of these conflicts are kind of coming to the fore again, like this new district, the East Bank district, that's being built out across the river from downtown, where there's some ongoing kind of debate and discussion about street design there in terms of accommodating street traffic and emergency response, including to a stadium, while also trying to advance the goals of making a walkable and bikeable neighborhood. So I'm going to close in just a second here by the kind of emerging themes that we see from across these case studies and across the other parts of the project include, fundamentally, the most important thing we saw across these places was that building trust and collaborative relationships between the relevant departments is really totally essential and irreplaceable. Developing sort of flexibility and solutions orientation among staff members so that people aren't just sort of going by the kind of letter of the law, but they're actually looking to solve problems together. Super essential. We found in a number of places that actually formalizing review processes was really useful, right? Because it made it so that there couldn't be this sort of later backtracking of saying, well, you didn't talk to us about that. But you'd say like, okay, even with staff turnover, if we formalize this process, we have a review process, everyone gets to have their say, we incorporate the feedback in a kind of standardized way that can really help things move forward in a more predictable way. We saw a bunch of places experimenting with pre-approval of common design elements, and often those were informed by testing, right? So actually getting out with cones and chalk and having vehicle operators maneuver around specific configurations to see what works for them and what doesn't, and then enshrining those in a kind of manuals of pre-approved designs. We saw, the importance of kind of balancing contextual sensitivity. So, like, understanding what will work in one city versus another, while also being open to learning from other places, including places in other countries where fire and emergency response and where transportation work considerably differently. We also saw that in a number of contexts, these kind of physical conflicts between fire and EMS response and street safety are actually they were just sort of proxies for deeper cultural conflicts, where the issues that people had with these interventions were not primarily about fire and EMS response, but fire and EMS response got invoked because of the kind of very strong veto power of those concerns. And sometimes fire and EMS officials were willing and in some cases eager to be a part of that opposition, in other cases less so. And then we saw that kind of stable and supportive leadership from both elected officials and agency leaders was really essential to making sure that people were sort of all moving in the same direction and helping to advance these goals, while recognizing the kind of really critical goals of emergency response and fire response, and the parallel uh, uh, goals of improving street safety. So I'm going to close there. My email's here. I'd love to hear from anybody. If you have questions later, you want to connect. If you have experience on these issues, we're always excited to learn more from folks who are in practice and facing these issues day to day. And then we can also, I think, take some time for questions now as well. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody.
All right, Zach, that was great. I do have a few questions for you. I had a couple of questions that were very similar. So it's sort of like, our fire departments open to simply using smaller vehicles to get the job done, especially since a lot of times they'll send out a large fire truck just for like a medical response when a regular ambulance would do.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and one that we talked with, we obviously talked with folks on various sides about that question. And it's a complicated one, right? Because one, what we heard from fire and EMS, or fire officials in particular, was, yeah, in some cases we can do a sort of right sizing or smarter dispatching, where we're sending out, smaller vehicles, SUVs, ambulances, to calls that don't require fire. And that seemed to, but the ability of departments to do that seems to depend a lot on the size of the department, right? So how many, and then also what vehicles are closest to the call, right? So they're often just sending out whatever's the closest vehicle and can get there the fastest. They're going to send it out. So that was, one of these kind of response time, the prioritization of response time above everything else was that's one of the things that drove those decisions to, you see they're sending out giant ladder trucks to, a relatively minor medical call, for instance. And so smaller departments we heard from in particular saying, look, we can't have a bunch of different equipment. We have the equipment we have and we have to work with it. There's also, efforts afoot to change procurement to buy smaller vehicles, but that also seems to be complicated in many ways. This is one of these places where the physical and the institutional come together, in the sense that, um, you know, there isn't a wide range of vehicles available on the U.S. marketplace, apparently. This is what we heard from lots of fire officials, that they kind of just, especially smaller departments, they don't get to tell the manufacturers what to make. They just gotta go with what's on the shelf, essentially. Um, and and also we heard from lots of fire officials saying, we have to be ready for everything. Our mission has grown and grown and grown. We now have to respond to active shooters. We have to respond to environmental toxics threats. We have to respond to everything. And so we need to have everything on the truck to manage that. So those were the kind of, like, the barriers to that kind of right sizing equipment, or smart dispatch. But we also heard lots of positive stories about places that have been able to do that, and that I think it is definitely one of the routes that holds a lot of promise.
All right. Next question. Have you found that the argument that if you make streets safer, it'll reduce the number of EMS calls to be like a persuasive reason to implement these policies?
I think it's really interesting. This is one of the places where I was glad that Austin was among our case studies because Austin does have this separate EMS and fire, and we heard, pretty different responses from fire and EMS. I think uh, fire officials from our interviews remain pretty squarely focused on fire response, even as the kind of call volume shifts ever more towards the medical response. But we heard from the EMS folks we talked to in Austin, there was a lot of openness to that argument, right? That like reducing call volumes by reducing serious injuries and fatalities on roads would benefit everybody, right? But I think that this comes down to that metric question, right? So how are these departments being evaluated, right? If primarily they're being evaluated on the basis of how quickly they can get to a call, and not like what are the overall safety measures in a community, then people respond to the feedback mechanism that they're given, right? So I think that's a kind of bigger picture issue of like how do cities incentivize the fire service to think more broadly about their mission, to reduce these kinds of incidents.
All right, next question. What's the single biggest thing that's stopping these ideas from spreading? Is it money, red tape, entrenched culture, or something else?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that some of the culture clash stuff, like, the places where there isn't a kind of tradition of kind of collaboration between transportation and fire, I think it's really easy for these groups to not see themselves as having the same mission, or being kind of aligned. And, there's lots and lots of kind of smaller physical and institutional tweaks that can and should be made. And yet, like, to really to implement those changes effectively, and to really be able to kind of continue innovating and solving problems. Because, one of the things that the vast majority of cities in the US and departments of transportation and fire officials are dealing mostly with inherited streets, right? Streets that they were not responsible for putting there. And so it's really complicated to figure out how do you, as our societal values around street safety change, and we want to be, encouraging the mode shift towards bicycling and pedestrian access and greater transit use and all these things, we're sort of trying to retrofit our streets in many places. And that requires a degree of flexibility, and flexibility requires mutual understanding and trust. And so I really came away from these interviews and this work with a real sense that investing in building trusting relationships, building institutions where folks can come together from these different departments, to find their shared interests, is really a critical part of the process.
All right, we'll squeeze in two more questions here. How were the case study cities selected? Was there anything particular about those cities?
Yeah, I mean, so we were looking for cities that had encountered different types of conflicts, and that had arrived at different types of solutions, so that we could understand how those things had unfolded. And we started from Berkeley. It's our home place. We knew the conflict here well, and so we knew we wanted to work here. And then the others really came through this process of just looking for some variation, right? And also variation in terms of the kind of political environment, right? The mode share, the old city, newer city, growing city, shrinking city, right? We were looking for variation to try to understand, and also, dual service EMS and fire versus separate EMS and fire. So we were looking to have as much variation between the cities as we could, while still, we didn't look at any really small places, smaller towns. Berkeley is the smallest town in our bunch, and I think we have heard from our CAC members and some others that, it's, in a future iteration, it would be great to look at some smaller cities to see, because they're operating under different pressures, I think, in many cases.
All right, last question. From all the places that you looked at, what's one unexpected or effective trick that a city planner can use to get a skeptical fire chief on their side?
Yeah, great question. I mean, Well, the study tour in Austin seemed to be really, really effective from what we heard. The study tour where the Austin officials went together to the Netherlands. Whether a truly skeptical fire chief would be willing to go to the, the Netherlands with the DOT chief or not, I don't know. But if you could get that skeptical fire chief to go on a study tour like that, and I think sometimes there's support for those things that come from federal DOT and elsewhere. I think that seemed to be very, very effective. I think it also seemed like really lining up the political elected leadership to make sure that they are voicing their support for these efforts. And so that the fire and other leaders are hearing that from elected leaders that this is really a priority. We got to figure out how to make it work. People can, you know, it might be easier to stay inflexible and just keep doing things the way people have done it. But if they're hearing from elected officials, city council, mayors, and city managers, and the cases where those are around, that this is a priority. It's not going away. We got to figure out how to make it work. That can be really motivating.
All right. Well, if you have any closing thoughts, now's your chance. Otherwise, we'll end it here.
No, it's just such a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for everybody for your attention, your great questions, and I really would love to hear from y'all. We're going to be issuing our report for this work in the next couple of weeks, and so look for that on LinkedIn and elsewhere. And then we'll be publishing peer-reviewed work out of it soon thereafter, and hoping to figure out how to roll out the work and keep it going from there. So would love to hear from anybody else who has experience on this stuff. So thanks again to Ben and Nick and all of you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. It was an awesome presentation, and yeah, thanks everybody for being here. We didn't get close to getting through all the questions, so we'll make sure to send Zach a list of everybody's questions and comments and everything, so he has that. And thank you everybody for all the engagement. And again, feel free to go to our Center for Pedestrian and Bicyclist Safety website, pedbikesafety.org. I just put in the chat box, I believe. You can sign up for our newsletter there at the bottom, follow us on LinkedIn. And also just to quickly plug our next webinar, which is just next week, August 26th, What Can Police Stop Data Tell Us About Traffic Safety? This one's coming out of Berkeley as well. So Safe Trek's Liza Lutzker. And they have a really amazing data set on police stops in California, and they're going to give us a really cool perspective on enforcement and safety. So feel free to tune into that one. And thanks again, everybody.
Thanks all.